My name is Lawan. I'm 72 years old, and I need to tell you something tonight that I spent most of my life getting completely wrong. Not slightly wrong, not partially wrong, completely wrong from the very foundation. I thought self-love was something you earned, something you arrived at after you had fixed enough of your flaws, after you had become good enough, kind enough, disciplined enough, spiritual enough. I thought it was a destination, a reward at the end of a long road of self-improvement. And so I spent decades on that road, working on myself, correcting myself, criticizing myself into better behavior, pushing myself towards some imagined version of who I needed to become before I could finally, legitimately, without guilt, love myself. And the destination never came, because it doesn't exist. And the road I was walking, the one I thought was leading me towards self-love, was actually leading me away from it, further away with every step, because you cannot criticize yourself into worthiness. You cannot earn what was never withheld from you. And the Buddha understood something about this that I wish someone had told me when I was still young enough to have saved all those years of unnecessary suffering. The Buddha did not teach self-love as a concept. He taught it as a practice, as something that begins not with what you do, but with how you see. Not with what you change, but with what you accept. Not with what you become, but with what you recognize about what you already are. And tonight I want to share 5 teachings, 5 essential understandings from the Buddhist tradition that transformed my relationship with myself more profoundly than anything I had ever tried before. Not because they made me feel good about myself in a superficial way, but because they showed me something true about myself, about you, about what we actually are, beneath all the noise and all the criticism and all the endless striving to be different than we are. The first teaching cuts through everything else like a blade through fog. You are not your thoughts. In Buddhism, this is not philosophy. This is direct observation. Sit still for 5 minutes and watch what happens in your mind. Thoughts arise, judgments, memories, plans, fears, criticisms, desires, an endless stream of mental activity that most of us mistake for ourselves. We think these thoughts are who we are, that the critical voice is us, that the fearful voice is us, that the voice that says you are not enough, you are too much, you have failed again, is the truest voice we have. But it isn't. It's a voice, one voice among many, arising in awareness the way clouds arise in the sky. And you are not the clouds, you are the sky. The vast, unchanging, unjudgeable sky in which all weather comes and goes without ever changing what the sky fundamentally is. The suffering that comes from poor self-love almost always begins here, with the mistake of identifying with every thought that passes through your mind, of treating the inner critic as the inner truth, of believing that because a voice inside you says you are lacking, you actually are lacking. But the voice that criticizes you is not more real than the voice that wonders at the beauty of a morning. It is not more true than the voice that feels moved by kindness. It is just louder, more practiced, more deeply grooved by years of repetition. And self-love, real self-love, begins with learning to disidentify from it, to step back far enough to see it as what it is, a thought, not a verdict, not a truth, a thought, arising and passing in the same awareness that has witnessed every thought you have ever had and remains undamaged by all of them. I spent years believing everything my inner critic said, years of taking its assessments as facts, as reality, as accurate descriptions of who I was and what I was worth. And the suffering of that belief was immense, not because the criticism was always wrong. Sometimes it pointed to something real. But even when it pointed to something real, the way it pointed, with contempt and severity, and the implication that I was fundamentally deficient, that was never true. And learning to separate the information from the cruelty, to hear what was useful and release what was destructive, to see the thought without becoming it, that was the beginning of everything. The second teaching is one the Buddha returned to constantly, because he understood that without it, nothing else could take root. Suffering is not caused by what happens to you. It is caused by your relationship to what happens. This distinction sounds simple. It is one of the most profound things I have ever encountered, because it shifts the location of the problem. And when the location of the problem shifts, so does the location of the solution. Most of us spend our lives trying to arrange the external world so that we can feel okay about ourselves. We want the approval of others so we can approve of ourselves. We want the success, the recognition, the love, the external validation that we believe will finally allow us to feel worthy. But this approach inverts the actual order of things, because your relationship to what happens is not determined by what happens. It is determined by something inside you, by the beliefs you carry, the stories you tell, the way you interpret experience through the lens of how you have been taught to see yourself. If you believe, as I believed for 50 years, that your worth is conditional, that you have to earn your right to feel okay about yourself, then every failure confirms the belief. Every rejection confirms it. Every moment of falling short confirms it. And you spend your life gathering evidence for a case against yourself that you have been building since childhood. But if you understand, as the Buddha taught, that suffering is not in the events, but in your relationship to them, then you understand that self-love is not something that external events can give you or take away. It is something you cultivate internally, something that becomes the lens through which you interpret events, rather than something those events determine. If something in these words is finding you tonight, if you recognize your own patterns in what I am describing, then stay with me. And if this message reached you at a moment when you needed it, then perhaps this space is meant to be part of your path. Come back when you need reminding. Because self-love is not a destination you arrive at. It is a practice you return to, again and again. And having somewhere to return to matters. The third teaching is the one that most surprised me when I first truly understood it. The Buddha taught that self-compassion and compassion for others are not two different things. They arise from the same source. They are fed by the same water, and you cannot genuinely offer one without genuinely practicing the other. Most people with poor self-love are extraordinarily compassionate toward others. They give generously, they forgive easily, they make allowances for human imperfection in everyone around them. But they apply none of this to themselves. They hold themselves to a standard that they would consider cruel if applied to anyone they loved. They speak to themselves in a way that they would never speak to a friend. They refuse themselves the compassion they extend so freely to strangers. And the Buddha saw this not as virtue, but as imbalance, not as selflessness, but as a kind of self-violence disguised as goodness. The practice he taught is this. When you extend compassion to yourself, you are not being selfish. You are recognizing that you are a human being like every other human being, that you suffer like they suffer, that you try like they try, that you fall short like they fall short, and that the same tenderness you offer others in their falling short is not something you need to earn before you can receive it. It is something you deserve simply by being alive, simply by trying, simply by being here, doing your imperfect best with what you have in the circumstances you find yourself in. This does not mean lowering standards or excusing genuine harm. It means meeting your own humanity with the same gentleness you would bring to the humanity of someone you deeply love. I remember the first time I tried this. I had made a mistake, a real mistake, not a minor one, and my inner critic was savage, relentless, the kind of internal punishment that goes on for days and serves no purpose except to make you feel worse. And instead of letting it continue as I always had, I tried something different. I asked myself, if someone I loved had made this same mistake, what would I say to them? And the answer came immediately. And it was gentle, honest but kind, clear about what happened without being contemptuous about who they were. And I gave that to myself for the first time. And something shifted, not the mistake which still existed, but my relationship to it and to myself. The fourth teaching addresses something that quietly destroys self-love in almost everyone without them ever identifying it as the cause. Comparison is the architecture of suffering. The Buddha taught that the ego, the constructed self, the story you tell about who you are, lives entirely through comparison. It knows itself only in relation to others. It measures and ranks and evaluates constantly. And in this measuring, it is never satisfied, because there will always be someone who has more, who has achieved more, who seems more. And the self that measures itself against others can never rest, can never feel enough, because enough is not a fixed point. It moves. It is always just beyond where you are. And spending a life trying to reach it is spending a life in a race that has no finish line and a direction that leads only further from yourself. Self-love becomes possible when you step out of comparison entirely. Not when you win the comparison, when you leave it. When you stop measuring your interior against other people's exterior. When you stop assessing your worth by the metrics that culture has handed you, and begin asking different questions. Not, am I enough compared to them? But am I living in a way that is true to what I actually value? Not, do I measure up to some external standard? But am I becoming more of who I actually am? These are questions that comparison cannot answer. They can only be answered from inside. And that is exactly where self-love lives. The fifth teaching is the one that holds everything else together. And it is the most radical of all five. You are already whole. This is not an affirmation. This is not positive thinking. This is the central insight of the Buddha's teaching on the nature of the self. That what you are at the deepest level is not a collection of flaws to be corrected, or qualities to be developed, or deficiencies to be overcome. What you are at the deepest level is already complete, already whole, already sufficient for life. The journey of self-love is not a journey toward wholeness. It is a journey of recognizing the wholeness that was never absent, of removing layer by layer the beliefs and the conditioning and the criticism that covered it, of returning gradually to the truth of what you actually are. This does not mean there is nothing to learn or grow or change. Of course there is. Growth is beautiful. Growth is natural. Growth is how living things live. But there is a difference between growing from wholeness and growing toward wholeness. Between changing because you love yourself enough to keep becoming more of who you are, and changing because you hate yourself enough to believe you are not yet acceptable as you are. The first kind of growth has joy in it, curiosity, spaciousness. The second kind has a desperation in it, a grimness, a quality of never quite arriving. And most people spend their lives in the second kind without ever knowing the first kind exists. My name is Lawan. I am 72 years old. I live in a small temple where the trees do not apologize for being trees, where the river does not compare itself to other rivers, where every living thing is exactly what it is, completely and without apology, and is nourished rather than diminished by that completeness. These 5 teachings from the Buddha did not make me perfect. They did not remove my flaws or resolve all my difficulties or make my life simple. They did something more important. They changed the ground I stood on when facing all of it. They gave me a self that was not conditional, not dependent on performance or approval or the absence of failure. A self that could be here, imperfect and trying and sometimes falling, and still know in the deepest place that it was enough, that I was enough. Not because I had finally earned it, because I had finally stopped believing the lie that it needed to be earned. Before we part, I want to ask you something. Which of these 5 teachings do you most need right now? Not which is most interesting. Which one, if you let it in, might change how you see yourself? Tell me in the comments, because naming it is often the first step toward receiving it. And if these words found you tonight in a moment of need, then this space is here for you. Come back whenever you forget, because you will forget sometimes. We all do. And that is not failure. That is being human. And being human, fully and without apology, is exactly where self-love begins.